All right, so let's dig into what's happening over in Gaza. I mean, it's February 2025 now, and we've got this ceasefire holding. But we all know how volatile things are over there, right?
Absolutely. And the IDF pulling out of the Netzarim Corridor back on February 9th, well, that really did shake things up.
Yeah, that's kind of where we're going to focus our deep dive today, looking at, what this withdrawal means for everyone on the ground, the humanitarian situation,
Yep.
and obviously all the political stuff that's going on behind the scenes.
Right, because it's all connected.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So get ready for some pretty intense stuff. I mean, we're talking about the corridor basically turning into a ghost town. Families going back to literally nothing.
Yeah.
And then there's a big question mark over what Hamas is going to do next. Plus, we'll even touch on some of those wild proposals for Gaza's future.
Yeah.
The ones I'm talking about.
Oh, yeah, those have definitely been making headlines. It's interesting you use the term game changer for the Netzarim Corridor, because that's exactly what it was for the IDF when they took control back in October of 23.
Right, October 27th to be exact.
Right. And we're talking about this 4-mile stretch of land that basically cut Gaza in two. You had Gaza City to the north, and then the more densely populated areas in the central and southern parts.
So basically, whoever controlled the corridor controlled everything and everyone moving between those areas.
Exactly. Controlling the flow of people, resources, you name it. It was a key strategic objective in a conflict like this.
And it wasn't just about controlling movement either, right? They were trying to disrupt Hamas's operations too, prevent them from moving fighters and weapons around.
Oh, absolutely. That was a huge part of it. There were even efforts to evacuate civilians from the north where the fighting was most intense.
Right, trying to get them out of harm's way.
Yeah. The IDF saw it as a way to gain a tactical advantage. And to a certain extent, they did succeed. It allowed them to carry out those targeted operations, like the raid in Nuseirat back in June 24, where they freed those hostages.
Yeah, that was a big moment.
It was. But the real question is, did they fully capitalize on the corridor's potential strategically? Some analysts believe they could have been more aggressive, particularly in those early days when so many people were fleeing south.
Man, I remember seeing those images on the news. Endless lines of cars, packed with families, people walking for miles with whatever they could carry. It was chaos.
Total chaos. And in the midst of all that, there's this debate over whether the IDF missed opportunities. Could they have identified and apprehended more Hamas operatives or even freed more hostages?
Because they essentially had this choke point, right?
Exactly. They had this incredible choke point. But there are questions about whether they used it effectively. Some argue that a more thorough screening of those fleeing Gaza City could have really weakened Hamas's network.
So it's like a tactical victory that, in hindsight, maybe wasn't as decisive as it could have been.
Right. Some might even call it a missed opportunity.
Yeah.
And now the IDF is gone, and the corridor has taken on a whole new meaning.
Yeah, now we're seeing these really powerful images of Palestinians returning to what's essentially a ghost town. Homes reduced to rubble farmland, completely destroyed.
Mm-hmm.
An image that really stuck with me was this photo of a man named Osama Abu Kamil setting up a tent next to what used to be his house. It's hard to even imagine trying to start over after something like that.
It really highlights the immense human cost of this conflict, and it raises some serious questions about what's next. Now that the IDF has withdrawn, you have this power vacuum, and there are a lot of different ways things could go. Will Hamas use this opportunity to rebuild their infrastructure, or will they focus on reconstruction and helping the people who are returning to the area?
Or will they do both?
Possibly. It's hard to say. There are also concerns that the corridor could be a trap, a carefully staged area designed to lure the IDF back in. It's a very volatile situation.
Definitely. And then on top of all that, you have the ongoing hostage situation, which adds another layer of complexity. The release of those 3 Israelis, Eli Sharabi or Levi and Ohad Ben Ami, that was huge news. But their condition when they came back, people were drawing comparisons to Holocaust survivors.
It was a stark reminder of the brutality of this conflict, and it put a lot of pressure on Netanyahu. He was already facing criticism for how the war was handled, and now he's trying to balance the public outrage over the hostages with the security concerns that come with negotiating with Hamas. It's a tough spot to be in.
It really is. And he's also trying to keep an eye on the bigger picture, that ultimate goal of lasting peace, which feels further away than ever right now.
That's the irony, isn't it? In the midst of all this chaos and violence, everyone still talks about peace, but no one seems to know how to actually achieve it.
Speaking of peace, did you see what Trump said about the U.S. potentially taking over Gaza? Where did that even come from?
It was definitely out of left field, but I think it speaks to a certain level of frustration with the lack of progress in the peace process. Like, maybe someone outside the immediate conflict needs to step in and force a solution.
Oh, like a global referee.
Right. But Obviously, the reaction was swift and negative. The Egyptians, they all pushed back hard. They see it as a recipe for disaster. And to be honest, relocating millions of Palestinians is not only logistically impossible, but it's morally reprehensible.
Yeah, it's like something out of a bad movie, Gaza Makeover Extreme Edition, completely ignoring all the history, all the pain on both sides.
Yeah.
It's just not realistic.
Not at all. It's a superficial solution to a very deep-rooted problem.
And if Trump's idea wasn't enough to get people talking, then you have Netanyahu suggesting that a Palestinian state could be established in, wait for it, Saudi Arabia.
Another provocative idea.
Yeah.
And it really highlights how difficult it is to find common ground in this conflict. The very notion of a Palestinian state is already loaded with tension, and throwing Saudi Arabia into the mix just adds fuel to the fire.
It's like everyone's trying to pass the buck, right? No one wants to take responsibility for actually solving the problem.
And in the midst of all this political maneuvering, it's so easy to forget about the people on the ground, the ones who are actually living through this conflict.
People like Osama Abu Kamil, trying to rebuild their lives from scratch. They're the ones who bear the brunt of this conflict, and their voices are often the quietest.
And that's why it's so important to keep their stories front and center. We can't let the political games overshadow the human cost of this conflict.
We have to remember that behind all the headlines and the talking points, there are real people who are suffering and who deserve our attention and support.
Exactly, and their stories need to be heard.
It feels like we can't escape these proposals for Gaza's future, can we? Everyone's got an opinion on what should happen next, but actually getting them to agree, that seems impossible.
Well, I think that's because they force us to grapple with this fundamental question, what even I ask the future of Gaza? Like, what would a normal life even look like there after everything that's happened?
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, it's easy to get caught up in the politics and all that, but then you see images of what Gaza looks like now. And it's like trying to picture what normal would even look like in Pompeii after Vesuvius erupted,
Right. It's almost impossible to imagine. And I think that's what makes some of these proposals so interesting. Even the ones that seem totally crazy, they make us confront this idea of what's even possible versus what's just a fantasy.
Okay, well, we got to talk about Trump's suggestion that the U.S. could just take over Gaza. Where did that even come from?
Well, it's classic Trump, isn't it? Disruptive attention grabbing, and probably not based on any real understanding of how complicated things are on the ground. But I think underneath all that, it taps into this feeling that a lot of people have this frustration that the current players, Israel, Hamas, the Palestinian Authority, that they're just not capable of finding a solution on their own.
So it's like saying, you've had decades to figure this out, and things have just gotten worse.
Yeah.
So time for someone else to take over.
Exactly. But obviously it's not that simple. You can't just force a solution on people, especially one as radical as relocating millions of Palestinians. Like you said earlier, the Saudis and Egyptians immediately rejected the idea. And beyond the geopolitics, you have the moral implications, too. I mean, forcing an entire population to move that would be a humanitarian catastrophe.
It's like putting a Band-Aid on a bullet wound. Right?
Yeah.
It ignores all the history, all the deep-seated issues, the trauma that people have experienced on both sides. You can't just erase all of that overnight.
Exactly. And it ignores the fact that any solution that's going to last has to come from the people involved, not from some outside force.
Okay, so Trump's takeover idea is probably not going to happen. But then you have Netanyahu suggesting that a Palestinian state could be created out of, get this, Saudi Arabia. Is he serious?
It does seem like he's trying to pass the buck, doesn't it? Like, here's a problem we can't solve. Let's just make it someone else's problem. But I think it also reveals this tension that's at the heart of this whole conflict. Who gets to decide the fate of the Palestinian people?
Because it definitely doesn't feel like either Israel or Hamas is really interested in letting the Palestinians themselves have a say in their own future.
That's the real tragedy of this whole thing. It's always been about power and control. And the Palestinians have often been treated as pawns in this much bigger game.
So where does that leave us? If these big proposals aren't going to work, what are the realistic options for Gaza's future? It feels like we're trapped in this endless cycle of violence and despair.
Well, I think the immediate priority has to be addressing the humanitarian crisis. People need the basics: food, water, shelter, medical care. The images coming out of Gaza are just heartbreaking. People are living in tents, surrounded by rubble, struggling to feed their families, dealing with incredible trauma and loss. The international community has to step up, and not just with short-term aid. We need a long-term commitment to rebuilding Gaza's infrastructure and its economy.
It's hard to even wrap your head around the scale of the need, isn't it? You see those pictures of destroyed buildings, and it's like, wow, that's awful. But then you realize that Each one of those buildings represented families, businesses, entire communities, lives that have been completely shattered.
Exactly. And even if the aid does start coming in, there's still the question of who's going to be in charge. With the IDF gone from the Netzarim Corridor, there's a power vacuum, and someone's going to fill it. Will it be Hamas? Will the Palestinian Authority try to reassert themselves? Or will it just descend into chaos?
And what about those foreign security contractors who are still operating in the area? What role are they going to play in all this? It seems like it could just lead to more instability and conflict.
I agree, and that's why a clear political solution is so important. We can't just keep putting Band-Aids on things and hoping for the best. We need a framework that actually addresses the root causes of the conflict, not just the symptoms.
But what would that even look like? I mean, the two-state solution has been the go-to answer for decades, and it seems further away than ever.
It's true that the traditional two-state model faces a lot of challenges, but that doesn't mean we should just give up on the idea of a negotiated settlement. Maybe it looks different than what we've imagined in the past. Maybe it's some kind of confederation or a system where they share sovereignty. The details aren't as important as the willingness to actually come to the table and negotiate in good faith.
But wouldn't that require a level of trust and cooperation that just doesn't exist right now? We're talking about decades of animosity, violence, broken promises. It feels naive to think that they could just suddenly change all that.
It would definitely require a massive shift in mindset. And that's why it's so important to focus on rebuilding those relationships, creating opportunities for dialogue, fostering understanding, and addressing the trauma that's been inflicted on both sides.
It sounds like a long shot, like trying to put together a puzzle where all the pieces are broken.
It is a long shot, but the alternative, perpetual conflict and suffering, that's just not acceptable.
So we have these big proposals that probably won't work. We have this urgent need for humanitarian aid, and then we have this long-term goal of finding a political solution that might actually have a chance of succeeding. Feels overwhelming, to be honest.
It's definitely a daunting task, but I think the most important thing is to not give up hope. We can't let ourselves become cynical or despairing.
Because if we do, then we've already lost.
Okay, so we've talked about some of the big picture ideas, the immediate needs, the political complexities, but what about the actual process of rebuilding? What does that even look like? You know, after all this talk about the Netzarim Corridor and the humanitarian situation and those kind of crazy proposals for Gaza, I can't jump back to this question of lasting peace. I mean, can it actually happen in a place that's been so torn apart by conflict? That's the question, isn't it? It kind of looms over every conversation about this whole region. And honestly, there's no easy answer. We can talk about ceasefires and land swaps and all that. But real peace, you know, that requires something much deeper. It's about a fundamental shift in how people see each other, a willingness to move past that us versus them mentality.
That's what gets me. I mean, we've seen so much hatred, so much violence, so much distrust built up over decades. It's like this huge chasm that can never be bridged.
It's a massive challenge for sure. But I think it has to start with acknowledging the pain, the trauma that's been inflicted on both sides.
Yeah.
You know, we talked about those 3 hostages who were released their condition when they came back, the comparisons to Holocaust survivors. Those were powerful images and they caused a lot of outrage, rightfully so. But we can't forget about the Palestinian families who've lost loved ones' homes, their whole way of life. Their suffering is just as real, just as deep.
It's easy to get caught up in your own side of the story, right? Your own sense of victimhood, and then the other side becomes the enemy. But that just keeps the cycle of violence going.
Absolutely. And that's why those little glimmers of hope we talked about are so important. You know, the fact that there are Israelis and Palestinians who are willing to sit down together, listen to each other's stories, try to find common ground. They're the ones who really understand that security has to come from mutual respect and understanding.
They're the ones planting those seeds of peace, even in a place that feels completely hopeless.
Yeah.
And it reminds us that peace isn't just some political slogan. It's something that everyday people are working towards.
That's right. And it's often dangerous work. They face criticism and even threats from their own communities, but they keep going because they believe that a better future is possible.
You know, that makes me think about something I read about the Netzarim Corridor itself. Amidst all the destruction, all that rubble, there were these stories of Palestinians trying to salvage what they could from their homes, their farms. I remember this one quote from a man who said, "We have to rebuild not just our houses, but our hope." It really hit me.
That's a powerful statement. It speaks to this resilience of the human spirit, right? This refusal to give up even when faced with unimaginable loss. And I think it highlights the fact that peace building, it's not just about political agreements or economic development. It's about restoring hope, a belief that things can actually get better.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I'm feeling a lot of things. Sadness, of course, because of all the suffering, frustration with how stuck things seem politically. But also, I gotta admit, a little bit of hope. Maybe it's naive, but seeing people still working for peace, even with all this chaos, it makes me think that maybe a different future is possible.
I think that's a really important takeaway. It's easy to feel overwhelmed by how complicated this conflict is, to feel cynical or like it's hopeless. But the fact that you're engaging with it, trying to understand it, asking tough questions, that's a sign of hope in itself. It means you haven't given up on the idea of a better future.
And maybe that's the first step, right? Refusing to look away, acknowledging the problem, and then asking ourselves, what can I do? How can I help build a more peaceful future?
That's it. It might feel like a small thing, but every action, every choice we make can have an impact. It could be supporting an organization, helping people in need, talking to people who have different views, learning more about the conflict itself.
Like that butterfly effect, right? One little change can ripple out and create something much bigger.
Exactly. So don't underestimate the power of your own actions. Your voice matters. Your choices matter. And when we work together, we can create a world where peace isn't just a dream, but a reality.
Well said. And with that, I want to thank everyone for joining us on this deep dive into what's happening in Gaza. It's been a heavy topic, but I hope you found it insightful. We've looked at the conflict, the human cost, the glimmers of hope. And I encourage you to keep learning, keep talking about this, and most importantly, never give up on the possibility of a more peaceful future for everyone.